The first thing to do will be to download the tutorial files and put them on your C drive in the Sapphire Nuke Tutorial 01 folder. Because Nuke uses absolute paths for everything, this is just going to make it so you don't have to remap any files that we have set up for you. Next up in this copy to presets folder, there are these .gp files. These are the Sapphire preset files. We're going to put those into C program data genart Sapphire presets so they're available for us in the browser. So we'll copy and we will paste those in. Okay. Now we're going to jump over to Nuke. We're using Nuke 10 and we're using Sapphire 10. We're using the ray render feature of the new version of Nuke quite extensively. Obviously it's a bit of an experimental feature in this version, but it's working quite nicely for these purposes. First off, let's look at what we have going on here. We have a basic node tree setup of a little 3D scene render. It's all coming in off an Alembic file with the scene graph that just gives us this object here broken into about 4 different components. And there's, for now, just this kind of global Phong plus reflection shader that's across the whole thing. All right, and that's rendered out and we're taking a look at it. If we hit 2, we can see the same scene just in the old style traditional scanline render. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at setting up textures for our objects using Sapphire plugins. Over here you can see we have a bunch of materials created and some apply material nodes that are disabled at the moment. I'm going to turn those on. And each of these is set to apply to a different part of the Alembic file. You can see this main core part is pretty black, and that's the one we're going to create a texture for and apply it to. So under this constant one node here, I'm going to select it and hit tab S underscore grunge. It's a pretty awesome Sapphire node that gives us great procedural noise textures. So let's zoom out here after we've viewed it, and you can see we have this kind of concrete distressed material. There's quite a number of parameters for this node, but you can see even if I just grab some different stamp styles, we get different styles of results. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go load preset. It's going to bring up the preset browser. And I'm going to select this 01 create core file. That's the one I've created for you. So this gives us the texture that we want. Now we run it through a few different nodes to get it a little bit higher res and to grade it. And what we've got over here is you can see we have a curvature map and we also have an ambient occlusion map that we have both baked out of Substance Designer. And we're doing some basic Nuke processes to affect and grade our texture with these. And now we have an image that has ambient occlusion baked in. It's doing a curvature-based grading on our Sapphire-generated texture. Cool. All right, so now let's go back to this render no-op node at the end here. Hit F to frame up, and now you can see we have our texture applied to our 3D object. All right, so one other texture we're going to create and apply is one for the reflection sphere in the environment. You see I have a sphere over here and I have a merge geo that's disabled. I'm going to re-enable that, and let's go to our 3D view, and you can see that we have our object sitting amidst this reflection sphere. Okay. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use another Sapphire node to generate a texture for that environment sphere. Often you'd bring in an HDR image. We're going to use a procedural node to generate some noise so we can control the results of what our reflections are. I'm going to select this constant 2 node. I'll hit tab. I'll type S underscore AUR and I'll get Sapphire Aurora. Now I'm going to hit 1 on that so we can view it, and you can see that we have this Aurora Borealis style noisy diffuse texture, and I have a spline control here so I can control how this works. And once again, there's many parameters for the control points and the colors and the kind of noise. What we're going to do here is we're going to load a preset that I've built. That is this 01 preset right here. Say load. All right, and so you can see we have that classic kind of light, cool color at the top, light, warm color at the bottom, sort of HDR style to give us that kind of natural sort of daylight outdoor look. And so I'm going to click on Aurora, and I'm going to hit tab S underscore hue sat bright, because we're going to want to jack up the exposure on this to get the kind of lighting we want. So I'll click on this, I'll load a preset. I have this 01 preset here, you can see, which basically just boosts up the brightness by a value of 10. You can see we have a lot of overbright areas there. So now if we look at our render node here, and let's look at our results, You can see that we get this great environment lighting effect now across this whole thing, getting some nice sheen on the metals because of our environment sphere. If I were to select the Aurora and the HueSat Bright and disable them, you can see that we don't get that extra nice little lighting hit, and with them enabled, we get that. This is a way to use different Sapphire nodes to render textures that we're actually using on 3D objects in Nuke. And so next up, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how to then post-process this in various ways. Now that we have our object textured in Nuke using Sapphire nodes, we're going to look at some other Sapphire nodes we can start using to do some post-processing on this image. So first up, we're going to use a glint to take these light areas on this object and add some really, really beautiful looking glows. So you see we have another 3D rendering chain in this scene, and the result is very simple. It is just a matte pass for those lights. We're shuffling that into RGB, and then we're multiplying on that on the original image. And now I'm going to lay down a tab S underscore glint node. So wire that source up to this multiply here, and let's look at the result. Okay, so you can see that we have this big glow glinting effect. I'm going to scroll down here and turn off the show size. Okay, and so there's a lot of parameters in here as well. We can control the brightness, and the other great thing we can control is the size and then the actual, parameters of the different pieces of the glint. I'm going to go to Load Preset. And we're going to bring up this 01 preset I've created for you and say Load. Okay, and now we will wire that into the A input of this screen. Let's clean that up with a dot, and let's look at the output of the render now. Cool, so now we have this nice glow effect out of the little, energy emitting parts of this object. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how to use the depth channel to do a Z-depth blur. So we've got our depth shuffled out here. Let's take a peek at that. Alrighty, and now we're grading that so we have, a more extreme contrast grade across this small object. Now we're going to feed that into a Sapphire Z defocus to get a Z-depth blur effect. So I'm going to go tab S underscore Z. Let's pick Z defocus. We'll drag this over here to wire that into the normal image chain, and then we'll grab this Z buffer input, put it under the grade, and I will just clean that up. And let's look at the output here. All right, so obviously you can see that's a big crazy defocus. Let's look at that. Let's change some parameters. We could first, let's change the defocus width down to 5, and then you can see we have this show instead of result in focus zone. And I quite like this. We can control the focal depth. You can see it's actually slicing through the image. Again, I have a preset for what we want this to be, so I'm going to load that up. I'm going to pick this 01, say load, and voila. So now we get this nice defocus on this small object here, quite high quality. It's great. All right, so now we've taken a look at how to just do some basic post-processing with glinting and with Z defocusing, very fast, very efficient, and really good-looking results with these plugins in Nuke. There's a number of really fantastic nodes in Sapphire for doing color correction. I use these a lot just to get a final really beautiful image and to give, a little organic feel to very CG imagery. So let's go to the end of our chain here under our Z defocus node. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up one of the vintagey effects. So I'm going to go tab S underscore V, and I'll bring up this vintage color 3 strip that's named after a film developing process. And let's just look at the output of this. And you can see, I'm going to go right into the load preset mode with this one, because you can see, if I just click on these, there's a number of different stylization things, and a lot of them just kind of colorize or contrast things in different ways. We're going to pick the 01 preset that I've made, we're going to load that up. We're going to take a look at the result, and then let's look at the output of the Z defocus and the result of this. And you see we get a combination of stuff where we're getting a little bit more punch, a little bit more contrast, a little bit more saturation, although technically there's actually less saturation in this, but we get a nicer feel of the color. And it's one of these great plugins that just gives us, again, a bit more punch of a final image without just putting an aggressive S-curve or crushing our darks completely. It just kind of ups the vibe. All right, so now we have this final little image we're going to render out just for this project, then we'll move on to the larger one. And one thing we're going to do to wrap this up is we're going to increase the quality of the render. Obviously, if we go to 100% here, you can see that we have a lot of jaggies, and this isn't quite, a production final finish quality image. So we're going to do two things. Number one, I'm going to go to my ray render node, and I'm going to change the stochastic samples from 3 to 5. What we're also going to do, and I found this with the ray render node and some experimenting, is that we don't want to just keep cranking the samples up and up and up, because we're just going to hit sort of diminishing returns in terms of performance. So what I've been doing is we're going to feed in a background image that is twice as large as the scene we want, and then this reformat down here is going to take care of then sizing that back down. So ostensibly we're rendering this at 4 times the resolution and then squeezing it back down. It's a technique that's used in a lot of different things in the CG process, where we just want to basically be able to create more anti-aliasing by merging those pixels together. So I'm going to go to this constant node here that's feeding the ray render. I'm going to go under format, and I'm going to go make a new format, and I'll call this double size. So I'll make this 3840 by 1600, hit OK. All right, now let's wait and take a second for this to all run through. So obviously every rendering system, everything has its own quirks, and we're using this environment in Nuke that's a bit new, and it's fun to kind of figure out how to get it to do what you want in the most efficient way. All right, now that's rendered out, and now we can take a look. Let's zoom in at 100% here, and you can see now we have our jaggies have been smoothed out, and we have a much nicer looking final rendered image. Okay, so now I'm going to go to my render node here. Let's frame that up. Tab right. Go to my file. Let's go to our render folder, and I'm going to call this GST scene 01.exr. Let's overwrite the one that I had in there, and we'll render this out. And there we go. So now we have created an image starting just from a raw Alembic file, and we have used primarily this Sapphire grunge node to create a really great distressed metal texture on this object. We've used the Sapphire Aurora node to create our reflection sphere to get nice reflections and highlights off of this image using Nuke's new Ray render node. And now we've also used Sapphire Glint and Sapphire ZD Focus to get a little bit more sexy post-processing with defocusing and glinting. And then we've used just a straight up vintage color 3-strip node to give us just an easy, quick and dirty, nice punchy color correction to finish this up. All right, so now that we've done this basic scene and looked at a couple different nodes, next up we're going to dive into a considerably more elaborate scene, look at this stuff broken out in even more variety, and then continue on with more things we can do with Sapphire within Nuke. You can see that our script is a bit more elaborate. We have a lot more going on in our scene, but it's all based on the same principles we used to build the much simpler, smaller scene of this one object here. So first thing we're going to do is we're just going to up the render quality of the scene, because now we're going to focus more on post-processing effects of what we have here. So I'm going to go down here, and first off the bat, I am going to pause my render view, and I'm going to select my Ray render node. I'm going to change the stochastic samples to 3, and I'm going to go to my constant node, and I'm going to change the format to a new format. Again, we're going to call it double size and make it 3840 by 1600. Okay, cool. So now we're double size resolution. We have this ray render set to 3 stochastic samples. Again, we're looking at the end, and I'll unpause. So now we're just going to let this run, do a higher res render at those settings, and then we'll take a look at how this whole script is built. All right, now our scene is rendered out. If we zoom in here, we can see that we have a considerably nicer, smoother final result for our image. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to take a look at the overview of this network so we can see some other Sapphire nodes in action, and before moving on in the next chapters to looking at different post-processing we can do. So we basically have the same network up here that we built previously, creating our material for our crate. We can look at our Sapphire grunge node. We can see we have that texture, and we are adding in some different baked maps to sort of flesh this out. And you can see that we have different results using different presets on the Sapphire grunge node, allowing us a lot of versatility for these kind of organic, distressed effects. And it's pretty great to be able to do this within our compositing environment, to have this really great 2D, 3D blend without having to move back and forth between different 3D or texture generation software packages. Got some other examples of this over here. Again, sort of tiling this at different degrees to get different resolutions for different size geometry, or just overall changing the presets and the settings to get different results for different things. All right, let's look at one last example down here for the little module. Again, a lower, basically res version of the texture because it ends up being on a different size piece, and then using that Sapphire generated, procedural texture with our baked maps together to give us a lot of versatility in this part of the pipeline, which is awesome. So we have our beauty pass here. And if we look at over here, we have a matte pass. If I hit the A to get my alpha channel, we have a separate node we're using just to generate that, and I'll explain that in a second. If we look at this disk cache, you can see that now I'm doing an RGB matte for our glint controls of 3 different pieces of lit geometry separately. And finally, over here, you can see we have our background image, and we can see our ray render working with our reflections to give us our background image. The reason we have this separate alpha channel here is because with our main render, because we are using this environment sphere to get us some extra nice sheen on everything, and because we're reversing the normals with this normals node to get that reflection working properly, we also don't have all the kinds of controls we might have in a normal renderer, and so we can't do a hold out matte or sort of an invisible and primary or secondary rays option for that sphere. So I'm basically just rendering out a separate alpha channel again with very simple materials, so it's really lightweight, and then just copying that back in. So then we get our alpha channel back, and then we're putting that over our background, because if we had it all together in one scene, obviously the background would block the internal elements from that reflection sphere, and we wouldn't get that effect. So, just combining some different things and faking some stuff and doing some trickery as we do in CG, just to make everything work right in this unique rendering environment. All right, and moving down our tree, we basically just extrapolated out the same thing we did with our glinting, but now instead of just for one object, we have 3. We have our lights at the top of the scene, we have our yellow lights along our energy wires here, and then we have those little same blue lights on our different kinds of crates and boxes. And that's all combined together, and then we're looking at the output of a ZD focus node here, which is just giving us a ZD focus out. Here we've just taken all the techniques we looked at in the simple scene and just kind of multiplied and expanded and done them a couple times. And now we're going to move on to adding quite a bit more post-processing down the network here to get us a really beautiful final frame. And here we are where we left off. Our last node here is this Sapphire Z defocus node. And now it's time to do some nice color correction and tweaking to get this to a really nice final frame. So I'm going to select my SZD focus node. I'm going to hit tab. I'm going to type S_distort, and we're going to get distort chroma. You can see right off the bat that's going to make the image really crazy. And this is a good example of, too, some of these Sapphire nodes that are incredibly versatile and sometimes seem like they're just doing some wild thing over the image, but we can really rein them in to do a lot more subtler stuff that gives us really great optical and organic distortions. So obviously this just turns this image into this psychedelic freakout, which could be desired, but what we wanted to use it for is to do chromatic aberration on the edge of the image as often as done to give you sort of an optical as if shot through a real lens feel. Okay, so first off the bat, I'm going to make this a lot subtler. For example, if I made this blur lens 400 and brought the amount down, let's say to like 0.05, you can see already it's tremendously subtler. I have a preset I built, so I'm going to go load preset. And click on this O2 option here, and I'm going to load that in. Okay, so you can see that it actually seems a little gets kind of crazy on the edges, but it's a lot subtler than what we had before where the whole image is turned into something else. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use a Sapphire vignette to control the area of this image that gets affected. So instead of doing a vignette where we're sort of darkening the edges, I actually want to create an inverted vignette where we're actually light on the edges because that's where we want the effect to be. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to lay down a constant node. It's going to be my root format. I'm going to lay down a Sapphire underscore vignette. So we're going to feed that constant into this vignette. All right, and we get black. So first I'm going to load a preset. And you see we have this O2 vignette chroma. So let's load that in. You can see that now we're doing sort of an inverted vignette. We can control the color, and I've just done a bunch of settings already here to control the radius to get this all set up the way we want. Now I'm going to feed this vignette into the mask input of the distort chroma. And now you can see we're getting this subtle chromatic aberration distortion on the edge of our frame, but it's subtle. If I turn this off, you can see it's just only the edges are getting affected, and it's a considerably subtle effect compared to if we turn this back to what it was before. Let's make it 1, and turn this to what I think was 96 by default, right? You can see that it gets pretty crazy. So let's set those back. All right, so now we've done our chromatic aberration, and now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay down an overall glint. We've done specific glinting on different things, but sometimes we'll do a glint across everything just to give a little bit of scene glow. So with the distort chroma selected, I'll go tab S_glint. By default, this is going to be pretty wild, so I'll load in the preset we've built for this. This O2 preset is going to do it. Load that in, and let's do an AB here. You can see that it's just giving us this kind of nice horizontal highlight across everything. If I go to my size details, you can see that I've turned down the Y and the diagonal quite a bit. I'm going to turn off the show size so that UI bit goes off. Okay, so now let's continue down the chain here. I'm going to add a light leak. So I'm going to go tab S_light leak. And this simulates, the sort of old school film light leak, kind of, as if a camera had light pouring into the gate from somewhere it shouldn't be. And you can get some really nice effects. In fact, I know people often use stock image libraries of light leaks to composite over footage to get some nice organic effects and different kinds of color overlays. And this is awesome because now we can have control over that within Sapphire. So if I straight up just go to load preset here, so you can see there's a number of ways this plugin can be configured, and we can get all sorts of subtle or radical effects. We're doing something pretty subtle here, just to add a little bit of a color overlay. We're going to pick this O2 effect, which you can see is quite minimal compared to some of these other ones. And let me disable it and enable it, and you can see that it's just adding a little bit of like color haze and wash and atmosphere over the scene, just to add some nice variation in without being too radical or too hardcore stylized. Okay, so next I'm going to add in another vignette setup to control just a regular Nuke grade node so we can do a traditional sort of just edge darkening. So I'll go tab, grade, we'll add in a grade node. I'm actually just going to copy and paste that setup I had up there, pipe that into the mask input of the grade node. We're going to look at this vignette too. I have a different preset for this, so I'm going to load that up. We're going to click on O2 vignette grade. Just a little bit different. Okay, and so now we'll go to our grade node, and we'll have to switch this, of course, to RGB red because we're doing everything in the RGB color space with that. It's not an alpha channel. And let's look at this grade node. And what we're going to want to do is we're just going to want to darken the image just a little bit. So let me go to gain. If you can see that if I ride the gain here on the image, let me take this down to 0. It'll darken it a little bit. We do that with a multiply, same thing. So I'm just going to take this multiply down to 0, right? So if we toggle this grade node on and off, you can see we're just getting a subtle edge darkening controlled by this vignette. So just a really great way to create a really customized, circular fade-off shape that we need a lot in compositing and color correction. Okay, so now we've done those things. Next I'm going to do is I'm going to add a lens flare. S lens flare. Okay, so our lens flare is loaded. You can see the default one is a bit extreme and washes over our scene. So I'm going to go to my load preset. And again, we have a lot of different options for some great lens flare effects for all sorts of different purposes. I have a pretty subtle one we're going to use here. So we're going to go to this O2 preset that I've built, hit load, and bring that in. Now you can see that we're just kind of doing this nice cast, and there's not a lot of lens elements, but we get a nice bit of a glow. And I'm going to tuck this guy up here into the upper part of our scene. Let's actually just write it in so you can do the same thing. Let's do a 575 on the X and 830 on the Y. And I do this kind of lens flare stuff often where we have it a bit out of the frame, and it's really just kind of casting light from somewhere else, and it's not the kind of aggressive, big, planetary style lens flare, but it's just kind of used as a lighting element to also add more organic variation and atmosphere into our scene. Okay, so I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to turn off all the UI stuff just so we can see what's going on. I'll disable and re-enable that so you can see with both the light leak and the lens flare, we've just added in some nice extra color elements. So I've used a number of different Sapphire nodes to start richening up and enlivening our scene. We're still pretty washed out, and we need a bit more contrast and punch in this final image, and that's what we're going to move on to next, is doing another set of color correction tools to get this scene dialed in where we want it to be. You can see we have a script that we've been looking at, and we go to the end and we have our S_lens flare node. And what we did in the previous video is we added in a bunch of these Sapphire post-processing effects to give us nice lighting and glare and kind of give us some atmosphere and glow. Now it's time to use some different Sapphire nodes to really start getting our color correction and final look dialed in. So first off, we're going to add in a Sapphire film effect. So I'll click on this lens flare and type tab S_film effect. This is a node I use all the time at the end of my chain just to really glue the image together, and it gets really great results, often a lot even subtler than this. So you can see the defaults, you know, it really crushes everything, you know, you get a bunch of grain in there. What we're going to do is we're going to dial some stuff back. Just a quick overview of the settings, some of the important ones. You know, we can scale how much that color correction is happening. We can change, you know, what negative or print film this is based on. You know, obviously, even if we're doing pure CG stuff, there's no real film stock, but we can kind of choose one that maybe looks good with the scene we're doing. And then we can also control the amount of grain there is. All right, so I'm going to load in a preset I built. This O2, and you can see there's quite a number of extreme effects that can be done with this node. It's really awesome. So I'm going to load this in. All right, again, I'll hit the D key so we can A/B this. We can see we're starting to get an image that's getting closer into our zone. All right, next, one of the things I'm going to do is I need just to fix the gamma, because we need a little bit of a harsher gamma curve on this because it is still a little too flat. So with film effects selected, I'm going to hit tab S_gamma, just do a quick Sapphire gamma node. I have presets for everything here, so we're going to load that preset browser up, bring O2 in, load that up, and you can see that I'm just crushing the gamma down 0.75. So that's making a big difference. So if we get rid of these two nodes, the film effect and the gamma, we're pretty flat, and with just those two, we're starting to get a really nice image starting to come together. Okay, so now I'm going to do a Sapphire with gamma selected. I'll hit tab S_hue sat bright. Basic hue, saturation, and brightness. Obviously, we have Nuke nodes such as grade and color correct and everything to do this stuff. But it's nice to also have some of these Sapphire versions of things that just have different controls or a subset of controls just for doing, you know, simple control of specific things. So I'll load in a preset here. I'm going to load in this O2. Right on, and there we go. We're just bumping up the saturation 1.5%. So just giving us a nice little saturation boost there. As we did in the previous scene, now I'm going to lay down a vintage color 3 strip. So I'll type Sapphire S vintage color 3 strip. Okay, and you can see that off the bat, this kind of makes everything quite a bit more bold and saturated. So I'm going to load in the preset I built, which is this O2 preset. All right, and again, we're going to A/B this. Nice. You can see that we're getting some nice tinting and overall just kind of punch and saturation boost. All right, and finally, to wrap this up, I'm going to lay down a Sapphire S_clamp chroma. Right on. So what this is going to do is this is just going to make sure that my chroma and luma aren't going out into some wild range. And you can see that prior to this, you know, we might have areas that are over bright, or we might have chroma. You see there we have a blue of 1.39. After our clamp chroma, we're going to have a blue of 1.29. So it's just kind of bringing some things down, keeping some things within legal ranges, and then I'll often just do a normal, good old Nuke soft clip at the end then. Change that to logarithmic compress, and now you can see that we'll get nothing above a 1. It'll bring everything back down into a 0 to 1 range. Okay, so now we've gone, let's look at this, the output of this lens flare node. We've gone from this image, which obviously is pretty flat, but we have a lot of latitude and a lot of subtle gradation in here. And since we're working in floating point space, we have a tremendous amount we can push and pull everything. And we've added a bunch of different Sapphire effects to, you know, subtly at each step change the color correction. I'm not using any one node to do everything. I'm doing a bunch of different subtle things, even combining some different vintagey effects with the film effect and the vintage color 3 strip. You know, bringing some normal Nuke nodes in there as well, like to do utility things like the soft clip. And here we go. We end up with this really rich, really beautiful image, you know, combining Nuke nodes and a lot of the power of what Sapphire can do to really kind of take our image to the finish line. So we've taken a look at the power of using Sapphire within Nuke to do a bunch of different things. We've looked at a simple scene to explore how we can do techniques from 3D texturing all the way to post-processing, and then we've extrapolated those out to a larger production scene to see these things really in action. And there's a lot of advantages to this workflow, primarily being flexibility in play, because we're not jumping back and forth between applications, and we have a lot of control within one environment to do everything from our texturing to our final image post-processing. There's limitations, of course, and we can't do everything that we could do in a full-on CG pipeline, but it's nice to take a look at ways to use these tools in creative ways to create imagery efficiently and to get some really beautiful final results in a really, really wonderful environment like Nuke.